Jeremy Paltiel, also longtime friend of Professor Frolic, Professor of Political Science, Carleton University. He taught previously at the University of Alberta, 1984 to 1990, also at UC San Diego and University of Arizona. And Jeremy did his bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies, University of Toronto, and then he did a diploma in philosophy at Beijing University in 1976, right, in China, 1976, and his MA and PhD at University of California, Berkeley. Jeremy's ties with Professor Frolic, as far as I understand, go back to his time period in Beijing in the mid-1970s, right, during that period when Jeremy was in China, and to the Canada-China Scholars Exchange Program, if I understand correctly. Jeremy and Bernie have much in common in terms of Jeremy's PhD dissertation, which was on comparative study of political succession and economic reform in the Soviet Union and China, but also Jeremy's interest in the Communist Party, elite politics, civil military relations. And Jeremy has made many contributions ongoing to the study of Canada-China relations, including currently on a SSHRC-funded large-scale project, multi-year project. And most recently, Jeremy Paltiel has published 2016 an article in Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, Resolute Ambivalence, Canada's Strategy Toward China and the Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Elena and Greg, for giving me this opportunity to give back. I was never Bernie's student, but I feel privileged to call him my mentor. I met Bernie almost 47 years ago in Hong Kong in October 1974. Actually, I might have met him a little earlier. He might have interviewed me for the Canada Scholars Exchange, but that's sort of lost in the mist of time. But in October 74, I remember very well, as the second group of Canadian exchange students prepared to enter China. It was just after October 1st. For some reason, the Chinese authorities didn't want us there for the 25th anniversary of the People's Republic, so we had to enter after October 1st. And with whom we traveled together. The second group of Canadians prepared to China, David Zweig, who we just mentioned, among the other people, Tim Brooke, who was my classmate in Chinese, from U of T, Ellen Judd, now at the University of Manitoba and past president of the Canadian Anthropology Society, CASCA. That's a fairly good percentage, given 4 out of 8 of us who went in are now leading Canadian scholars on China. The others included Jan Wong, Suzanne Tachereau, who's worked in development work for many years, Paul Helliker, and the biographer of Li Gaxing, Tony Chan. And 3 of those were from York and associated personally with Bernie. We met at a hotel in Hong Kong, and later on we walked over the bridge at Lowu, before there was a Shenzhen, where there were just rice fields on the other side, crossed into China, had lunch, and I remember it's a green stucco building, as we waited for the train to Guangzhou, and then in the evening, we took the evening train from Guangzhou to arrive in Beijing 36 hours later. The Chinese trains did run on time at a steady 50 kilometers an hour. Bernie was our Canadian minder and our paymaster, who would deliver our pay of $150 each month, the equivalent of about 300 yuan at that time, just 100 yuan less than a vice premier made at their official salary. We would meet at the main branch of the Bank of China, which was the former Russo-Asiatic Bank at the edge of the old legation quarter by Tiananmen, south of the Great Hall of the People, a building which at that point had not really been renovated since the Boxer Rebellion. And for us in Beijing, Bernie was somewhere between boss and paterfamilias. Bernie and Irene sponsored my first Passover Seder in Beijing, to which my parents contributed an air package of matzah and gefilte fish. He is a good patriarch in the finest Judeo-Confucian tradition. Right? I think he was one of those people who, he's not the only one. You have the Joseph Levinsons, the Schwartzes, and others in the Judeo-Confucian tradition. But he is one of the members of the Judeo-Confucian tradition who never neglects his benevolence and his enhui to his juniors. And I could use the phrase in Hebrew, when we refer to our father, we call him Avi Mori, our father and our teacher. He's my father and teacher. When I contemplated my life after China, he was my referee for graduate school. He became my steadfast referee for every scholarship I applied for, including my Shirk doctoral fellowship, every academic job I applied for, and my subsequent Shirk grants also, not the most recent one, but the ones before.
Any mistake?
He was and remains my mentor. He has also served in at least 2 PhD committees that I was supervisor for as an external examiner. He has continuously sowed the seeds of academic scholarship on China in this country and beyond. We are both living fossils, having entered academia in the Jurassic and now defunct field of comparative communism. When I first met him, I was just out of my teens, having only just graduated with my BA months before. He took the train from Moscow to Beijing in 1965, from Moscow State University, and I took the train in the reverse direction, from Beijing University to Moscow 10 years later in 1975. I left the field of Soviet studies a little earlier in my career, having abandoned Soviet studies at Carleton my first year and transferred to East Asian studies at U of T. But I'm grateful to him for having involved me as his junior colleague in so many of his projects, including a memorable trip from Vladivostok overland along the North Korean border to Jilin in 2001. Bernie has an outstanding record and commitment to fostering academic research. He sows the seeds, and we all reap the rewards. I think his role as a catalyst here in this country and beyond should not be underestimated. And that's reflected in all the edited books, etc., which he carried through. Moreover, he has the distinction of coining a widely used term to describe civil society organizations in China, the Gongo, a government-organized non-governmental organization. He therefore enjoys the rare distinction of coining an oxymoron in active use. Karl Marx was asked by a German reader after the publication of the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867 whether he planned to publish his complete works, his gesamtliche Werke. My German is not as good as yours. He replied wryly that he couldn't do so because they had not been written yet. This reminds me of Bernie's reply whenever I tried to needle him when he intended to finish his follow-on volume to Reluctant Adversaries. And I feel, when I started writing this, as I showed it to my wife, she said, "You shouldn't say things like that." But now I feel that everybody else has mentioned it, so I can mention it too. And so, and he would always say about contemporary Sino-Canadian relations, "I just don't know how to end it. There's so much going on." And indeed, he was right. To work on China is to be continuously transfixed by transformation. It is like a drug, and the fact that he has been unable to retire proves the addiction. When British merchants, some of whom were our Baghdadi co-religionists from the subcontinent, brought chests of opium to Canton, they could not have imagined that they would afflict themselves with an addiction to China. But I think that that's our opium today. As for Bernie's book, he couldn't finish writing it because he was always so busy doing it. In between stints at the archives, he would be organizing conferences, training thousands of Chinese officials, hosting delegations, and generally lubricating the machinery of the Sino-Canadian relationship like no one else in the academic world. First, the Joint Center with U of T, then with Weikar and the Schulich School, Bernie has probably brought together more officials and academics from China and Canada than anyone else living in this country. What he needed to finish the book was a Boswell, someone who would follow him around taking notes and compiling the biography, which would be, at the same time, would be a biography of the Sino-Canadian relationship.
Yes. Volunteers.
Those of you who know Bernie as an academic know that he has little patience or aptitude for fancy theory, which is probably a handicap when you're trying to reach a conclusion of a magnum opus. So without building a fancy architectural apparatus, let me attempt something that sums up a career. Next week is Passover, which, as you know, celebrates the Exodus. Now, the book of Exodus in the Bible begins with the names of those who went down to Egypt with Patriarch Jacob. And then verse 8 says, and then it says that the children of Israel were extremely fruitful and they multiplied so that the land was filled with them. And then in verse 8 it says, V'kam b'Mitzrayim paro asher lo yada et Yosef. And there arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, I think that, and the Bible says that basically, who did not remember Joseph. Joseph, who had interpreted Pharaoh's dream and saved the land from famine. And afterwards, you know the story, the Jews were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, and Moses came, etc. But I want to use this image, there arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who did not remember Joseph, as a metaphor for the state of Sino-Canadian relations in the Harper era, and how it continues to affect us today. We elected a government made up of those who were not involved in this long and active process of bringing together Canada and China and connecting China and Chinese to international society and globalized capitalism. Soon after that, a global financial crisis and a self-inflicted debacle by the US in the Middle East leapfrogged China into a leading international role with all the consequent pride on one side and fear on the other. Speaking of fear, over half a century ago, Harold Isaacs wrote a book called Scratches on Our Minds that describes the ambivalent relationship between the US and East Asia using an analysis that today would be called cultural studies, but that term hadn't yet been invented. He pointed out that there were two binaries in US attitudes towards East Asia. The first was shifting sympathies between China and Japan. And the second was a binary between the Asian that is wise but inscrutable, but also meek and feeble, and the opposite, the cunning and cruel mask of Fu Manchu. And he shows how historically the attachment to these images from China and Japan flips. Now, we are in one of those phases today. The image is flipping, or has flipped. And there is now a danger of painting China with the mask of Fu Manchu. And my plea is that we not forget Joseph, which is my immodest way of characterizing Bernie's work. He has shown, and we should have learned along with him, that it is possible to cooperate with China. You know, there are two kinds of vestigial memories that I get every time I come back from China after a long time. The first is the taste of coal, its taste. And the other is how difficult things are to get done. And it's sort of like you forget about it when you're outside, you go there and everything is difficult. Now, the difference between China and Russia or Soviet Union is in China things are difficult and they can't be done always officially, but in Russia they're impossible. Things are difficult. So from the very beginning with China, the glass was always half full. And I wrote in an article, does a half-filled glass justify a leap of faith? And the thing is that there will always be those who will call the glass half empty. And Bernie's work over the years has shown that it is possible to cooperate with China in different kinds of ways, despite the difficulties. And it's possible to cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party, which, while not as benevolent or as benign as it would like to pretend, is neither single-mindedly intent on world domination and undermining our way of life, but nonetheless feels threatened by our liberal values. That's true. Bernie's work shows how fruitful cooperation was and continues to be economically, administratively, academically, and socially. We should not squander his legacy, but should build on his guanxi and carry them forward. For our own sake, for the sake of Canada, and for the sake of the world. Just as Mao's people helped to humanize the face of the Red Guards, we need a successor to help humanize the face of relations today. Now, I'll close with Confucius. Confucius said, at 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I planted my feet firm upon the ground. At 40, I no longer suffered from perplexities. At 50, I knew the biddings of heaven. At 60, I could hear them with a docile ear. And at 70, I could follow the dictates of my heart, for what I desired was no longer overstepped the boundaries of right. Now, at 80, Confucius was already dead. So we do not have his words of wisdom for advice on life after 80. So all I can do is wish Bernie in the Mama Luschen bis 120 to 120, which is what the greeting is traditionally in our own tradition. And thank you very much for your career, and thank you for listening.